Moral injury occurs when there's a betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. You can move beyond moral distress to moral injury when you have an identity crisis and your meaning system blows up. It's a serious affliction, but it's not a disorder. It's a normal response to really devastating conditions. If you shove it down because you don't want to feel those things and try to avoid it, what you wind up doing is just accumulating the pain at a level that can come up and bite you later. It really can help a lot to be in a group with other people who understand your experience.
Welcome to Respond to Resilience, along with Dr. Stacey Raymond. I'm David Dashinger. On this episode, we'll be speaking with Dr. Rita Brock. She's the director of the Volunteers of America Shay Moral Injury Center. We'll be talking about moral distress and first responders. We'd like to invite you to like and subscribe YouTube, Respond to Resilience, Facebook, Respond to Wellness Inc., and Responder TV. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and LinkedIn. And go to our website, respondertv.com, for past episodes and the guest information. We'll be right back to speak with Dr. Brock after this.
In this family, more of us die by our own hands than by the hazards of the job.
In this family, up to a quarter of 911 telecommunicators have symptoms of post-traumatic stress.
In this family, our mental health and wellness are in crisis,
while responders are quietly suffering.
In this family, many struggle with job-related stress,
burnout, trauma, sleep disruptions, substance abuse,
and relationship problems.
In this family, we can help the helpers.
With vital information and resources,
resilient strategies,
and success stories of overcoming the obstacles.
In this family, no one is alone.
Welcome to Respond to Resilience with co-hosts retired Lieutenant David Dashinger, Dr. Stacey Raymond, and Bonnie Wimley, LCSW EMTB.
And we want to welcome Dr. Rita Brock to Respond to Resilience. She is the director of Volunteers of America Shay Moral Injury Center. Dr. Brock developed the Resilience Strength Training, REST, program to help U.S. military veterans cope with moral injury. The evidence-based program now supports healthcare providers, social workers, and others experiencing moral distress and injury. The latest iteration of the program is VOA Rest for First Responders, a national campaign and free peer and confidential support service to help fire, police, EMTs, and ER staff process experiences of moral distress and build and maintain resilience and remain committed to their work. Dr. Brock is the first Asian American woman to earn a doctorate in theology, and she's the author of a few books and many essays. Dr. Brock, welcome to Respond to Resilience.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Dr. Brock, I'd like to start by asking for a little clarification. The terms moral distress, moral injury, moral suffering. I've heard of all of these, and if you could just articulate for us the differences between those.
Sure. I think they all begin with the human capacity for conscience. So we have a conscience, and life isn't perfect, so we do things wrong sometimes. And if it's someone we hurt or something we ourselves did wrong or was done wrong to us, we try to sort it out. We ask for apology, give an apology, try to fix the moral problem. But sometimes it's not fixable. Sometimes there's just nothing that can be done. It's what's done is done. And that can cause you to lose sleep. Sometimes you might be more distressed about it. Once an apology is accepted and forgiveness happens, that you move on. But if you get a little stuck on something that you can't quite fix, and it can even interfere a little with your best functioning. That's also an ordinary experience. I, had nights where I lost sleep trying to sort something out and had to spend maybe a long time figuring it out, but I figured it out. For example, a lot of that hits you at once, or you really didn't figure it out and it was bad enough that it starts to really haunt you, or it's a cataclysmic thing like a major global pandemic or war, and it's at a level that you can't get your arms around it. It's really affecting you. You can move beyond moral distress to moral injury when you have an identity crisis and your meaning system blows up. And that is serious. You may start drinking because of the moral pain you're in. You may use drugs. You may work to exhaustion and not be yourself, shut down emotionally, or even think about ending your life. It's a serious affliction, but it's not a disorder. It's a normal response to really devastating conditions. It's like if you were in a global pandemic and you weren't bothered by it, I think something would be wrong with you. So it's not that you're weak or that you have now a mental illness. It's just that life can be that bad, and it creates this what I would generally call moral suffering. And so, so that level of pain, you really need to take care of it, because your very sense of who you are is affected, and maybe even your life. And you may, in an odd way, by attrition, by drinking too much for a long time, take your life in that long-term way, or you may actually die by suicide because you can't live with the emotional pain of that kind of moral suffering. And the sad truth is that if you are in that kind of pain, it means that you actually have a good person inside that wants out. Your conscience is actually working.
Boy, thank you for explaining. That really helps.
Let's focus even sort of deeper into the topic and look at the first responder world, where first responders are out there doing the job and experiencing maybe large scale or small scale incidents that could be affecting them, and also within their agency, sometimes there are things that go on that could be affecting them. Can you tell us, in that world of first responders, what causes moral distress?
Well, I can give you an example. I was teaching a class in New York on moral injury at a seminary there, and I had a chaplain from the New York Fire Department. And she told me that there were still members of the fire department who were haunted by that siren sound, that they wear a siren on their body in order to, if they're in a situation of needing help or people can't find them, they can be found. And they spent 9/11 in the pile of rubble trying to save people. And all these sirens were going off, and they couldn't save anybody.
The pass alarm.
And they couldn't save anybody. And she said some of them were still deeply haunted by their failure to save their team members, and this was years later. Of course, this was 9/11 was a long time ago, but it still haunts them. And I don't know if that you would call that a deep moral injury, but it's a serious kind of moral distress when you just can't figure it out and can't let it go either.
I recall, on that note, a firefighter who responded to 9/11. He was on the South Tower pile, and he also talked about the pass alarms and the sound of them. But he said there was a tone that was sounded when they went from, it was a rescue mission, and then it was switched to a recovery mission. He said his heart fell because he hadn't rescued anyone, and now it was recovering bodies. And he was crushed by that.
There are lots of people who quit their jobs, who gave up. It was just too hard to cope.
Right.
On top of all that, 343 losses that day.
Oh yeah.
I was there with this chaplain on one of the 9/11 commemoration days, and they all meet in a bar in the village and ring a bell 343 times at 3:43 in the afternoon on 9/11.
We remember growing up in families where challenges were part of daily life. Adverse childhood experiences shaped who we are.
Many of us, like you, have faced trauma early on. But instead of breaking us, it forged our souls. Just like superheroes who were bombarded by mysterious cosmic rays and used their new powers to save the world, adversity turned us into rescue warriors.
We were inspired to save people from going through what we endured as kids. We learned to bring calm to chaos.
Our strengths were forged in the fires of a painful past. Like a phoenix, we rose up from the ashes and found meaning in our experiences.
Whether we become police officers, firefighters, EMTs, paramedics, 911 dispatchers, animal control officers, or corrections officers, this stress-induced growth fuels our desire to help others.
Responder resilience, turning adversity into the power and the duty to serve and protect.
There's another situation that I heard several times from paramedics, and for a more recently, the COVID, the pandemic, where they could not transport, if it was in the case in the beginning where there were a lot of elderly getting sick and passing away, they could not take the spouse in the ambulance with them because of COVID precaution. And they had already transported enough elderly people knowing that this person is likely to pass away, and their spouse is not allowed to be with them when that happens. And so the moral injury from that, they are following a rule, but their heart is breaking because they're witnessing the spouse waving goodbye to the ambulance, and that is likely that was in many cases the last time they saw each other.
Sometimes the law is cruel, and when you have to enforce something you experience as cruel, it can really mess with your sense of being a good person. Yeah.
Well, that was totally my experience during COVID, responding to EMS calls, and we're responding like, out of the movie Contagion, like we're wearing, full Tyvek suits, the mask, the shield, face shields, and to just add that into the context of we're taking somebody on probably what's their last ride in an ambulance when their loved one has to stay behind. I think it could be devastating for people.
It can, and it is, and we wouldn't want people to get so callous that they didn't notice, right? That's the paradox of the kind of work that first responders do. Is it's very high stakes, life or death often, and vulnerable people sometimes at their worst, and yet you have to try to be kind and careful with them. At the same time, you also have to take care of yourself and your team. It's a really complicated process of such rapid decision making that there really isn't time to mull what is the most ethical thing to do here. You go on instinct a lot of the time, and experience if you've done it a long time, but it doesn't necessarily feel good.
Right, and decision making is such a huge part of all the different first responder professions, and you have to live with that decision, right? Not only does the people affected by the call have to live with it, but we as first responders, officers, people who are supervising have to live with that. Can you speak to that? Like, how can we get relief from that relentless feeling of I could have done something different, better, I could have done more?
What we've found in working a little bit with first responders and a lot with veterans is it really can help a lot to be in a group with other people who understand your experience. So other first responders, other veterans who are ready and able to listen empathetically to how much you're suffering because they get it. And they're not going to judge you or think there's something wrong with you. But they're going to listen, and being able to talk about it is the first step in processing it. If you shove it down because you don't want to feel those things and try to avoid it, what you wind up doing is just accumulating the pain at a level that can come up and bite you later. And so to have a way to just say, man, this thing happened and I just can't believe it, and I feel this way about it, and to have other people say, oh, yeah, I get that. That is such a relief. You're not, first of all, those kind of feelings are very isolating. So you're no longer isolated. You're with people that you connect to emotionally. And they may tell you something that you can offer empathy for. So it also feels good to do that for another person. And in a small group where that kind of processing is happening, it's kind of miraculous sometimes. But even at the end of an hour, we have this online 1 hour program that's facilitated by first responders, and at the end of the small group process, people will feel a whole lot better and they don't know how it happened.
Sure.
But it's really
Right.
empathy and listening and being listened to, validated, believed, and not judged.
Right. And it's very powerful when you were thinking or feeling something and you might have a little shame about sharing it and someone else says it and now you feel like you're not a weirdo, you know?
That's right. It's like, oh yeah, something like that happened to me too, and I felt guilty for a year. Those are like ordinary things that people feel, but when we feel them, we feel like I'm the only one.
Yes. Right.
Or if anybody knew I had done this, they wouldn't ever love me again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On that note, I recall a debriefing that I was a part of where I'll just give you the basics of it. It was a lover's quarrel. Both people ended up dying. It was a crime of passion, and the man stabbed and killed the woman and then turned and stabbed himself, and he ultimately died. He didn't die right away. So the police officers were saying, not only are we rendering first aid to the victim, we have to also render first aid to the perpetrator. And that doesn't feel so good, but that's what we have. We do that because that's our job. And then they're talking about the conflict that they have, that this man just stabbed and killed this woman. And yes, he stabbed himself and he's suffering, he's bleeding out, but they have feelings about what he did. But they're also doing CPR on him and trying to, stop the bleeding. Yeah. And they have an internal conflict. Can you speak on that a bit?
That having to help someone who's committed a crime can really feel crummy, especially if the victim isn't savable. And I think that there's levels of a sort of sense of outrage about it. Right? That it's not that's a sense where I think the feelings aren't so much guilt or shame, they're more outrage, a kind of fury about why does this person get to be saved and the other person had to die? Those kinds of sense of life is unfair, things aren't right, are also normal moral feelings that we have. This is nowhere near similar, but I used to be a college professor and I had students I didn't like in my classes, but I had to teach them too, and I had to give them fair grades. And so we often do things in conflict with our own feelings because there's a rule about the work. It's a professional calling, and so you want to live up to the standards of your profession. And so you're constantly balancing all those things. Your own instincts to want to punish somebody or remove them from your classroom because they're so bad and disruptive or things like that, that you have to fight those impulses in yourself also to do a good job professionally. And and you can have moral conflicts. Moral conflicts are just part of being a human being in an imperfect world.
Well, speaking of conflict, I was at a training where I saw video produced by Volunteers for America that I thought was incredibly powerful. I'd love to show it right now and then have you comment on it, Dr. Brock, and just give us a little insight into what went into creating this spot and how you think it represents moral injury or moral distress.
Sure.
So here we go.
That's powerful.
It is. I haven't seen it in a while. It's really striking. It was created for us by an ad agency. That's one of those ad agencies that sells cars and chicken and anything else like that. And it was a couple of younger ad people at the company that was assigned to work with me on an ad on moral injury. So they interviewed me about what it was, and I talked about how isolating and alone people feel when they have it, but they've got this conflict going on with their conscience, and they can't resolve it, so they sort of go through life in a state of feeling unconnected from the world they're living in. And so they got this, this is an Israeli form of dance that involves conflict. That was actually a dance performance we saw. And they dressed the two guys up that look pretty similar, and it's a street in Los Angeles. And so you see the person step. There's noise. He's in the normal world, and when he steps off the curve, he's inside himself and that fight. And the people that put it together were so thrilled to be working on it and excited about it, because they were really happy to be doing something more than selling a product, that what they did might impact people's lives for the better, maybe even save lives. And so it was really fun working with them. They were so dedicated, and it premiered in Times Square on those big NASDAQ screens. And so a whole delegation of us, the veterans from our program and me and staff, and the ad people showed up in Times Square for the 24 hours that it ran at the top of every hour. And we all had on T-shirts that asked me about moral injury. We were
that's great.
Walking around for a couple of hours in Times Square, just randomly talking to people. Have you seen the ad up there? And it was a really interesting experience, but they were so excited to be there and see their ad show up on those screens. And later that evening, I went to a play and came out. It was still playing at the top of every hour. And so at night, it was even more dramatic. I walked up there and I saw this young couple, and this woman was posing in front of the ad, and the guy was taking her picture. So I walked up to them and I said, "Oh, you like our ad?" She said, "Oh, I'm in it. I'm just..." Because we had stills after the struggle. We had still pictures of what looked like a nurse and maybe a doctor. And she was the one that looked like a nurse. And she said, "It's my first time to be on the screens in Times Square. And I want my mom." So he's taking a picture so she could send it to her mom. And she said, "It's such a great reason to be in Times Square for this." So even the models who did the ad were feeling this sense of this was beyond just advertising or performance. This was like going to touch people's lives.
Dr. Brock, why do you think this isn't something that people readily talk about?
I think because there's a lot of guilt and shame involved. And when we mention, we feel pretty bad about it. And we want to fix it. And if we can't, we don't want to talk. I mean, it's really hard to talk about. It's really difficult to talk about. And sometimes it's like you're afraid if people know this about you, they'll never love you again, especially if it's something you did wrong yourself.
Right.
When you're wrong, sometimes you're outraged. You may get together with other people who are, veterans who feel violated, like the government betrayed them. The Vietnam era veterans got into anti-war movements and other things because they felt betrayed. But I think when you yourself fail to prevent harm, or when you commit harm or even witness it, sometimes it really can make you feel horrible to the point you don't want to talk about it. I've had veterans say, "I'm never going to talk to my family about what I did in war because I don't want it in their heads."
Sure.
And you just touched on institutional abandonment or betrayal. Can you talk about that and how that relates to moral injury or moral distress?
That is actually the first definition that was made of moral injury, was done with Vietnam era veterans by a psychiatrist, Jonathan Shay, and our Shay Center is named for him. He was a good friend of the center.
Okay.
He wrote a book in 1994 called Achilles in Vietnam. And he said that moral injury occurs when there's a betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. So you can't get stakes higher than war. And the government, a lot of people were drafted. They didn't want to be there. They didn't believe in the war. Their government betrayed them by sending them to a war to get killed or to kill other people for no good reason. And a lot of them came home toxically angry, furious, and unable to function. They were so angry. And that sense of being betrayed is deep. I think we can experience it in relationships. I think people can be betrayed by those they love, and that a kind of moral pain that it goes to the heart and soul of who you are. What you love is the most important thing in your life. The way you sustain love is you be good and moral to people that you love. And when they're not moral back, that is just horrible.
How would that look in terms of first responder, fire department, police department, EMS agency? How would that kind of institutional abandonment or betrayal play out?
It could be the institution sends you into terrible situations and doesn't have enough support to help you work it through. It can be that your chief is having you do things aren't right, to cover something up, maybe some mistake made in the department where harm happened, and you're told to cover it up, so it doesn't get fixed. Maybe
a lack of training, feel like it's something you need to be able to do the job, and you're not being supported that way.
Or given the right equipment. Remember when there was not enough PPE? And I remember I gave every ski mask I owned to the local hospital because they needed face protection, because you need to protect your eyes as well.
Yes.
And in my condo building, people were sewing masks. And making plastic face shields out of just this foam rubber and rubber bands and anyway, people were trying to help out because there just wasn't enough. And I remember talking to a physical therapist about how she was sent to do physical therapy without protective, like trash bags and things like that. Not enough protective equipment because she's a physical therapist. She wasn't an ER doctor, but she was asked to go do physical therapy with patients who really weren't going to benefit from it and weren't really they were too sick to do it, but the hospital wanted to bill for it. And she was furious about being used that way, that she had to risk in wearing a trash bag and doing this medical work when it was really not. It was just about billing. It was about the money.
There's another form of institutional betrayal that's it's more subtle, where command staff or even one's other first responders within your department, they pass judgment about, if you're struggling with post-traumatic stress, perhaps they know you're on medication for anxiety or depression. Maybe they know that you're going to see a therapist. So that's another form of institution betrayal. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of stigma in high stakes jobs around mental health issues. And on the one hand, it can matter if someone isn't at their best.
Yes.
And a team relies on them to be able to do things, and they have a panic attack or something happens.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are good therapies, and being in therapy isn't a bad thing. And as long as your therapist thinks you're okay and good to go, right? But your team may not. Your team may be suspicious because there's already a stigma attached. And and for some people, like doctors, I think it's only 13 states don't penalize you for a mental health diagnosis. But in the other states, you have to report it to your insurance board and your licensing board. And you could lose your license or your insurance because you have the wrong kind of mental health diagnosis. So that's a serious, that's beyond stigma. That's your career is at risk.
Sure.
And in the military, of course, in the kind of places where you need a security clearance, they may not give you one or take it away because you create a vulnerability they can't afford to have. So mental health issues are very, very complicated. I'm not a clinician. I can't tell you which ones are. I mean, I know what PTSD is. I work with too many veterans not to know what PTSD is. But it is a complicated thing, and often we are not our best judge of when we should sit out.
True, right, because of that internal conflict, right?
And the desire to do it anyway, not to be weak.
Right.
Right.
Right. I can't be that person that is struggling with mental illness.
Right.
So can you articulate the difference between post-traumatic stress injury or post-traumatic stress disorder? Some people don't like the word disorder, so we tend to lean toward injury. And moral distress. Can you tease those apart?
It is hard because they share symptoms.
Okay.
Right. So anger, loss of sleep, depression, those are things that they share symptoms around. But with PTSD, what's happening in your brain is just your fear center is generating those feelings. So your fear center is like a smoke alarm that won't turn off. And so it's affecting your behavior. You may be startled easily. You may be constantly hypervigilant. You may be also angry because fear has aggression in it. You might or you might go flat, like depressed. Those are all things that can come from your fear center being too active and you're not being able to function in reality very well. You may have flashbacks even or nightmares where you relive the terrifying incident. That's all PTSD, and they're really actually getting better and better at treating it with protocols that help your fear center calm down so you can put together a coherent memory of things, because often there's memory loss with fear. Your fear center turns your memory system off when you're terrified, right? So the memories that you have are chaotic. They're stored in your right brain as bits and pieces, and so it's a jumbled up mess sometimes. So part of the therapy is to help you get a coherent memory, like this happened, and I did this.
Narrative,
a narrative. Once you have a narrative, you may realize you did something really horrible, and then you can feel really, really guilty or ashamed. That's moral injury. It's not a disorder. Right? And there isn't a protocol. There's no diagnosis. There is an exposure scale that people are using now to try to identify that moral injury is present by saying, I witnessed this, I felt this way about that. That those things will help you get a clue that people might have moral injury. But there's not like, well, then you send them to therapy and you do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And there are things that have been suggested by the clinical community, especially from the VA, about if you're a clinician and you think somebody might have moral injury in addition to the diagnosis of their mental health condition, there are things you can do in the therapeutic environment that are different from the protocols you're following for the diagnosis. Right. So they're trying to help people figure out how to deal with it if they're in a clinical context. But I think the best solution for moral injury, not solution, but recovery process, is to restore your relationships with people you trust, to reestablish that sense of connection to other people who care about you, and who will help you go through the same, because guilt, shame, fury, outrage, those are very painful feelings. And but they can be lessened. It's not like you're ever going to forget these things. So you have to figure out how you can come to terms with them as a source of information about your life, but they don't drive your life.
Sure.
And I think the shame, guilt, anger tends to isolate people, right? They'll pull back. And then the more isolated and alone they are,
the worse they feel.
And the worse they feel, right? Symptoms get worse.
Yeah.
But so they also feel like a bad human. I'm a different human. I'm a bad human.
Right.
And now it's just, they're in their head. They know what they did, and there's nothing for them to balance it with.
Right. Right. And just sharing it in a bunch of people who understand, who see the goodness in you, it's like so validating for them to, like, I get it. There's nothing wrong with you. That is a normal way to feel about what happened.
Yes.
And that you feel that way means you're a good person.
We're moving towards this topic, and that's the program that you created that's promotes healing. And
Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk about that. And also, what are the tools and takeaways people get when they go through the program?
Yeah, well, we have two programs that we've done. One that we've had for 2 years now. I think we created a version of our 1 hour online free program for first responders, and we train first responders to facilitate that program. And it's you just go into VOA REST and then / first responders, or just go to VOA REST and you'll find it there. And you sign up for an account so they can email you a reminder. And you see a schedule of meetings, and you just sign up for one of them and attend. And you just need a camera on Zoom and a microphone, and you can do it from your phone or from a computer. And it's just an hour, but it's based on an evidence-based program we developed for veterans that was actually very much longer. But we asked the veterans who were facilitators in that program, if you only had an hour with people to help them process moral distress, what would you do from the program? And so they gave us advice, because we didn't run the program. They facilitated it. They saw what happened, and they gave us advice on how to do it. And so basically, we've been doing it with the public since the pandemic. About 6 months after the pandemic started, we instituted it just for our own staff, actually, and then it widened out. And then we realized we needed a special section for veterans, which we have, and we have a special section for first responders, because those are two cultures where having people who've done that work matters for trust levels. And so it's free. People come repeat sometimes. Some people come episodically when they need it. Some people have used it once, but I think it's 82% of people who fill out a survey said they feel a whole lot better at the end.
Oh, wow.
And it's not meant to, if you have moral injury, we recommend more processing than that 1 hour. But if you just got something you are carrying, you feel bad about, you just need to talk to somebody about it. It's really helpful for that. So we have a 1-day program we started developing, I think 6 months ago. And we bring a team on site. And we did this at Miami-Dade with Fire and Rescue at Miami-Dade. And we had a group of about a dozen people who wanted to go through the program. We brought the two facilitators that had been first responders to facilitate it. And it was a day-long thing where in the morning they had time to explore more deeply difficult experiences they were carrying, and a chance to just talk about them and discuss how they're feeling. And we have this wonderful wheel called the Moral Injury Experience Wheel that a VA chaplain created that has a whole schema of feelings related to disgust, betrayal, perpetration, whatever. And we use that in the groups to help them not only identify the feelings that they might have themselves, but to put pins on a poster and you could see where the group is.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
Like a heat map.
Yeah, it is like a heat map. And it's really, our groups find that helpful. And then there's a lunch break. And then in the afternoon, they move into more deeply processing what's been happening with them and thinking more clearly about what values still matter to them. And so it's a rebuilding process in the afternoon of reclaiming your moral identity. And it might not be the same one you came in with. You might have to adjust some things. But then there's that sort of lift at the end of affirming that you're a good person, affirming that you still have values. And so we did that at Miami-Dade. And then the second day, we do a 2-day thing. The second day, people who were in the original group who went through the program are trained to become facilitators for the program. Okay. So then we left them with facilitators and they could keep having groups.
That's so great. Is there a component of spirituality and you mentioned chaplaincy? Does that come into play as well?
It does it does in the way that people talk about their own experiences. So it may be that somebody will say, I remember a veteran who didn't consider himself all that religious, but he went through a process of trying to deal with his moral injury, and he wasn't right with it. He still didn't feel right. So he did some yoga. He did a yoga thing, power yoga thing. And he got in touch suddenly with how angry he was at God. And he said, I'm not even religious, but I realized I was feeling fury at God because my best friend died in a truck next to me. And so he went and actually talked to a priest and forgave God. Right. So sometimes things like that come up for people. They'll say, I prayed and nothing happened, and I'm really angry about that. Or, but it's each person's own spirituality that emerges from what they say. And then at the end of the day, as they're talking about values, we actually ask the group to see if they have common values. Those are values that are deeply, mostly spiritual for people. But we don't impose a religious system. We see what the group has within it.
Sure.
Okay.
No, we're not. We're careful about that because faith is so personal for people.
Yeah.
And we don't want anybody feeling like something's being imposed on them. Although you may be in a group and somebody else will say, well, I sort of thought about this, and you may find some insight into your own faith that way. But we don't. But the facilitators for sure don't impose that. They may talk about their own faith. They're the facilitators there as members of the group.
Yeah.
So they're not there to fix anybody. They're just there to guide them through the process. And they participate as a group member also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, please share with us where people can find you or your programs online, social media, any other contacts you'd like to share.
Yeah, it's voa.org/rest, R-E-S-T. That's where you can find these groups.
Okay.
And I invite you to try one. For one thing, it couldn't hurt, and it might do a lot of good.
I'm ready to sign up.
Oh, great. We have facilitators who go and do groups themselves as members of the group, just because they need to process something. And I've done that myself too. It's really helpful.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Stacy, any closing thoughts?
I have a question. I have a last question. How did you get into the whole idea of moral distress and studying it and then creating programs to help people with it? What led you there?
Well, I think as a theologian, I worked as a chaplain early in my career with high school and college kids. And I think I've just been interested in human suffering.
Okay.
And part of that is also being an anti-Vietnam War activist in college, and then being a peace activist for all of my life. And when 9/11 happened and the two wars started, Afghanistan and Iraq, I was looking for a different approach to talking about the problems with those wars. And I realized that this moral injury concept that came out in an essay in 2009 was exactly what I was thinking about. And so a friend and I organized a Truth Commission on Conscience and War, where I met Dr. Shay, because he testified as the moral injury expert, but also so many wonderful veterans. And we invited a retired military chaplain to be the host of the commission. His name was Herm Kaiser Jr. He and I wound up founding a soul repair center at a seminary in Texas at Bright Divinity School, to help educate religious communities about moral injury and support for veterans. And then VOA invited me to actually create a program that might help veterans. And I was really excited about doing that. And Jonathan Shay agreed to co-chair an 8-person planning committee that created this program that we're now offering to first responders. So it's not something I made up. It's people who were really experts in the field of moral distress and moral injury that helped us create the program.
Oh, sure. Collaborative.
Yep.
So my final comment is how important this is. You use the words, soul repair program. I don't think we've ever used those words on Responder
I love
Resilience.
It, though. It's a great phrase.
We talk about, how to take care of yourself physically, how to take care of yourself mentally, how to take care of your family. But we don't seem to talk about the soul and what to do about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if there's anything that is the core of your soul, it's your conscience. Yeah. So we need to take care of souls too. Religious
Totally.
or not religious, we all have one, I believe. Yeah.
Well, this has been so great. We've really covered some uncharted territory for us on this show, and I want to thank you so much for being part of this and sharing your what you've created and what you're offering out there to be of service to people out there who are suffering. So thank you, Dr. Brock.
Totally pleased to do it. Thank you. Honored to be here.
Remember, like and subscribe, YouTube, Responder Resilience. We're on Facebook, Responder Wellness Inc. and Responder TV. We're also on LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. And go to our website, respondertv.com, for past episodes and guest information. Till the next time, stay safe, be kind to yourself. Take care.